Ubisoft is about to unveil Far Cry 5, the next entry in their open-world FPS franchise. So far, we've gotten small bits of information along with the cover art, which gives us some insight into how crazy this one will be. Let's just hope the rest of the game can innovate on their formula. Hey guys, JV here sharing my thoughts on how Ubisoft can improve and innovate Far Cry. Since the world reveal is tomorrow, I wanted to get this up before we see some actual gameplay or a CGI trailer and know more about the game. As always, if you like what I do here and want to see more, be sure to subscribe. To me, this conversation starts by looking at the history of the Far Cry series, and particularly with Ubisoft and the mainline games. So we're talking about Far Cry 2, 3, and 4. I know Primal is the most recent one, but let's be honest, 5 looks a lot more like 4 than Primal. Generally, each title includes the following. It's essentially a survival FPS. You've got a main storyline, a variety of different side missions that don't really change the way you play the game, but they're different ways to shoot and kill people. There's lots of guns, huge variety there. There's a massive open world with a ton of different vehicles that you can use to traverse it, and it's really beautiful. Starting with Far Cry 3, you got crazy outlandish characters like Voss, the cover boy for Far Cry 3, and a lot of other characters. His colleagues in the game were also absolutely insane. These very vibrant, colorful, interesting characters that really just heighten the entire experience. Far Cry 3 really innovated on this series in a lot of different ways as well. It introduced experience for killing enemies and a skill tree with abilities that you would work through. So kind of like a pseudo RPG system there, where you're really not role-playing, but you've got all these abilities and skill trees like you'd find in one of those kinds of games. Also, there's a large variety of play styles for each situation. For example, there's some stealth elements going on in Far Cry 3. When clearing out an outpost or something like that, you could easily get that done with your knife only or with a bow and arrow with no one else noticing. But of course, you also had the RPGs, the AKs, the very loud ways of getting things done too. It also introduced hunting, gathering, and crafting systems, which really kind of fleshed things out. There was a lot more to do in Far Cry 3 because nearly everything you killed gave you something that you could then use to increase your ammo pouch or the number of holsters you have, so you could bring more weapons into combat. And so that whole element was added. You could hunt in previous Far Cry games, and I'm talking about the mainline ones. Again, I don't want to upset any Far Cry fans. If I'm saying something wrong, let me know, but there wasn't a formal hunting system. You could kill animals, but in this game you have side missions and objectives tied to hunting down and killing these animals, and you really wanted to do that to get their skins in order to essentially upgrade your character. The series already had a variety of different kinds of missions, like I said, different ways to kill the bad guys, but in this game you had hunting missions, vehicle missions that were kind of like time trials that you would go through to deliver items. You had wave-based horde mode, so those were additions as well. And then circling back to the main storyline, we got the element of choice and consequence in Far Cry 3. It was choose this route and side with this faction or these people, or choose the other route, and usually there's an element of morality tied into there somewhere. At the very end of the game, you could choose Citra and stay on the island, or choose your friends and get the hell out of there, and that was a big decision there within this FPS game. You know, small little elements of choice, but you know, in context of the narrative, they were big choices. They really mattered. They had narrative weight. Also relating to the story and the setting of the games is that Far Cry always brings us to an exotic place that's very interesting and probably different than what you're used to. So in 3, we went to the Rook Islands and we encountered these pirates, and we played this white bread, you know, very young person who just didn't know what they were stumbling into. And then in 4, you go back to the Himalayan mountains where you're a descendant from, and it's just really interesting. They do a good job of bringing us to very interesting places and putting us in cool settings. And finally, another thing that stuck out in my memory is the game introduced radio towers, which is a way to uncover the map, of course, taken straight from Ubisoft's own Assassin's Creed with those viewpoints. Same thing there. It's just a way to uncover new objectives and see more of the map. Now moving on to Far Cry 4. The thing with Far Cry 4, Far Cry 3 was a critical and commercial success. A lot of people liked the game and still like the game. Far Cry 4 was a lot of the same stuff. In a way, it felt like Far Cry 3.5. Before I move on, I want to clarify what I mean by that, because a lot of people slap that onto sequels as a way to complain. And a lot of the times I say, it's a sequel. What do you expect? It's supposed to be similar. However, when you look at Far Cry and the mainline series and the Ubisoft games, there was a lot of innovation between each iteration, between each title of 2, 3, and then 4 unfortunately didn't innovate like the other two did. What Far Cry 4 did do right was continue with the crazy interesting characters. Pagan Min was a really insane character to watch on screen. And it looks like they're carrying this theme of insane characters into Far Cry 5. Just by looking at the cover art, we can see that that's what their goal is. So now that we've laid out the history of the series, I want to talk about what I really like about it. And I think generally the series is great at what it tries to do. It tries to be this solid gunplay FPS with a few variety of playstyles, again starting with 3 and carrying into 4. It is that FPS. It's a little bit looser. It's not the most tight, FPS I've ever played before, but it's an FPS with a large open world. It's huge, it's beautiful, and there are incredibly varied environments, especially with Far Cry 4. It's a game you could just take your helicopter up in and appreciate the beauty and be astounded by what you're looking at. And so I really appreciate that about these games. I also love the larger than life characters and over the top action of this series. In Far Cry, you're not expecting a simulator, so to speak, of an FPS, but you're expecting some explosions. You're expecting crazy things to happen, like elephants to come through and just knock out your enemies for you, like you can see in this clip here. Stuff like this happens all the time in this world. It's because it's just very dangerous and hostile. Everything can kill you. Eagles can fly down and just scratch your arm up. It's absolutely crazy. These moments are what sets Far Cry apart from other more generic open world first-person shooters, and this is where the series should stay. While I have really enjoyed the franchise, now let's talk about what I don't like about it and what I think needs to be improved. And first off, the Ubisoft trend of cramming the world with collectibles and pseudo-objectives that aren't really objectives. They're just go here and kill this guy for this reason. I really don't like that. And especially if you look at the map, you can see evidence of this. It's like someone vomited rainbow all over the map. It's very pretty, right? But it's so busy. There is so much going on, and I haven't even uncovered, I don't know, a quarter of the map in Far Cry 4, as you can see here. There's just too much going on. It's filler, and it feels like filler. Especially with the most recent Far Cry games, it feels like there's too much errand running, and there's a little bit of shooting mixed in here and there. It just gets away from the focus, and it really dilutes the experience, especially when your main story, talking about Far Cry 4, falls a little bit flat. It doesn't hit like Far Cry 3 did, which kind of exacerbates that problem. While radio towers do make sense from a narrative aspect, especially in Far Cry 4, you're trying to take down the propaganda of Pagan Min and rally the troops with the Golden Path, I think that this needs to go. I think it's a very tired element in Ubisoft games and Far Cry as well. I know it's only been in 3 and 4, I'm not sure about 2, but I think they need to go. They need to just get rid of this. In fact, I'd love to see them go back to Far Cry 2, where you had to physically pull up a map, and there were, some objective markers on there because that's necessary in games like this, big open world games. But I'd love to see the physical map come back, where you have to pull it out, look at it, maybe make some drawings or markings on it for objectives. I think that would be really cool. And finally, you see this with a lot of FPS games in the last 5 years. Far Cry is no different. There seems to be an over-gamification and half-assed RPG elements slapped onto this FPS. And I'm talking about the skill system and the abilities. And I'm not sure why we need experience in a Far Cry game, or why we need to learn all of these different things when we could have just been given the ability to, I don't know, drop down and assassinate someone from the very beginning of the game, or pull someone down from below to assassinate them. These seem like elements that could just be given to us at the very beginning of the game, or introduced at a narrative point, that are for some reason tied into a skill system that doesn't necessarily need to be there. Now, I understand certain things like upgrading your health or increasing the amount of time you get adrenaline from a shot. Things like that make sense when you tie it into a skill system, but getting experience for every little thing you do, I think is something that a lot of companies, a lot of developers wrap into their open world games where they don't need to. I feel that it detracts from the feeling of immersion that Far Cry could have. These are beautiful open worlds, and they could make you feel like you're there and experiencing it yourself. Instead, we have plus 50 for doing this thing and plus whatever for that. It really takes you out of it. So I've talked a lot about the series. Now let's talk about Far Cry 5 and what I'd like to see. And again, this is very rough, broad strokes because we haven't seen the official reveal yet. This was recorded before the May 26th reveal. So Again, just talking about what I just talked about, I'd love to see them get rid of those unnecessary RPG elements and introduce new mechanics over the story, you know, within the narrative instead, where it makes sense. An example of this could be, since we're going to be in Montana, the United States, maybe there's a way you can train a dog and use it to attack your enemies. That's something that I don't want to go through a skill tree to learn. I want to meet someone who knows how to train dogs, who teaches me how to do that. I want the narrative to introduce that to me instead of earning experience, going into a menu, choosing that skill, and then having it. I'd like to see them go back to the simplistic look and presentation of Far Cry 2. It's really a realism over stylized and aesthetic conversation here. We're talking about limited HUD. I don't want to see stuff all over my HUD. I want to feel like I'm there. I want to be immersed in the world instead of see some really cool, sleek looking stuff going on. That has a place, but I think it's run its course with Far Cry 3 and Far Cry 4. In terms of the amount of content, I want them to go for quality over quantity. I think there was too much filler content in Far Cry 4, way too much for me to justify spending an extra 20 hours doing all of it. I want some really hard-hitting, interesting missions that incorporate those wild, crazy characters that we know we're going to encounter. And I'd love to see more of these crazy characters accompany me on these missions. I don't want to just go to a quest giver and get something from them and then go and shoot some bad guys. That's usually what goes on in Far Cry. I'd love to see them change that up a bit. What the recent games have done so well is incorporate these psychedelic moments that you don't see a lot in video games, and they're usually caused by drugs. I'd love to see that in some form or fashion in Montana. I am sure there is some kind of meth or heroin problem in Montana. There seems to be that in certain pockets of the United States, and Montana probably has something like that, so it wouldn't be too far-fetched to expect something like that, and I'd love to see it. I want to see some crazy over-the-top action. Again, something the recent games have done really well. Sticking with that element really sets these games apart, and I think they'd be foolish to step away from that. Again, you could still have an element of realism, you just need to have some top-notch physics, and if they tighten up the gunplay a little bit, that'll be much better as well. I think Far Cry 5 needs to stick with these larger-than-life characters. Pagan Min, Voss, Citra, and some other characters I can't remember from Far Cry 3, but I remember our encounters were absolutely insane. They need to keep that momentum, and again, from the cover art, it seems like they've got that nailed down. Instead of falling back on the success of 3 and 4, I'd love to see Ubisoft take an opportunity here with this new setting to introduce new mechanics. Innovate on the series. Take us from Far Cry 2 to Far Cry 3. The last thing I'd want is for Far Cry 5 to just be a stepping stone to another game. I think they need to knock it out of the park here. So those were my thoughts on how Ubisoft can innovate on the series with Far Cry 5, but I'd love to ask you guys in the comment section below, what are your expectations for this game? Do you want to see them innovate this franchise, or do you want them to keep it focused like it has been? Again, 3 and 4 are great games. Like I've said, very well received. I enjoyed them personally, and so I'm not saying they were bad games and they need to change, but I would like to see them innovate on the series. Share your thoughts in the comment section below. If you're still watching and you enjoy the video, click the like button and subscribe for more content like this. Follow me on Twitter and Facebook so you don't miss another video. Sign up with Juniper to receive exclusive discounts on shirts, hoodies, and more at the JV merch store. Click the link in the description below for more details. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll talk to you next time.